right. Well, we are live, and Aaron will be right back, but we're live with Suzannah Alexander and Aaron Kindsvatter. Aaron, we've had a couple of really great conversations in the past. Thank you for being here again to talk with me again about this
Such a
really
pleasure to be here
important
with you.
issue. Thank you. And I'm just meeting Suzannah for the first time, but it's a delight to meet you and have you here. And Suzannah, you are a former or recent graduate student in a clinical mental health counseling program, and had some things happen in that program that you're going to share. And I'm really glad to be able to have this dialogue with both of you. So thank you so much. Suzannah, do you want to give a little bit more of your background, perhaps, for people who are watching?
Yeah. Are you talking about the background at the program?
Oh, yeah, the background of the program, and maybe what led you to, how did you come to be going back to graduate school? What was your interest in counseling, and how did you choose the program that you were in?
Well, I came back to counseling because I had just gone through a divorce from a bad marriage. And I felt like, first of all, I needed to make some money to support my family because I have 4 kids and they're all still living with me now as they go on to their higher education. And I felt like if I was to be able to go into counseling, I could make some of the things that I experienced and, that were bad about my experience in my marriage, could be beneficial to somebody else. And it would make meaning out of the difficulty that I had had in that area. And that's what attracted me to that. That and the fact that I, had to do extensive work on myself just kind of to go through that. And I had I guess a number of other experiences in my family growing up that kind of led into all of that, which had given me a lifelong interest in psychology. I had been interested in it when I was much younger and more impressionable. And I listened to my parents, when they said, oh, don't go into that. You won't make any money. A big mistake there. I wish I had gone in it then, then I wouldn't be going back to grad school now. But
It sounds like you were drawn to the profession for the reasons a lot of people are. And that's that life experiences have shown you the value of that kind of connection that you can find with another person who really wants to hear you and understand you and help you understand yourself. And you were an older student like myself coming back. Mm-hmm. So how did you find the program when you started? Were there red flags right away, or did you find it to be the experience that you were expecting? And what were you expecting?
Well, I guess I was expecting it to be a little more I guess politically left of center, just because that seems to be what I've observed of the profession, as a generality. Not all therapists are like that. But I had looked around at a number of different online schools, but I really wanted to be at a physical school. I thought that would be helpful. I am in the area, it's local, UT is within driving distance of where I live. And one of my other kids was going there at the same time. And, it was kind of like, well, we'll just be going together. And that seemed like that would be a positive experience. And I also felt like going to school in the community where I would then be working would make the most sense. If I was living somewhere that had been far away from a university, I would have looked probably a lot more seriously with the online schools. But given that I was so close, it just made sense to go where I'm going to end up being working, because then you can make the connections with the people. And I thought that would ease me back into the work world, because I as a stay-at-home parent, I have been out of the workforce for quite a long time, and making that adjustment all by itself is its own challenge. And I thought that would make all of that easier. And, there were some, in terms of the politicization of the thing, there were some red flags early on looking back on it. And what I didn't realize at the time was just how deeply entrenched the ideas were, how far down they had gone in that rabbit hole. I had a prior experience before I had moved to Tennessee. I was in a Unitarian church that was in the grips of what I think of as maybe like an early stage of this. It was the congregation was tearing itself apart. They had reached a point after gay marriage had become legalized. They did not know what they stood for anymore. And so they were really fracturing along similar lines that I see happening in the UT program. And I had navigated that successfully for a while. And I thought, well, it's going to be a 2-year program. It's really pretty fast. I'm not going to get politically involved, or at least I didn't think I was. And I just did not realize that, the minutia of my own behavior that would be seen as a huge red flag for them. I'm, having come from a situation where there was some, emotional abuse. I wasn't really receptive to the idea that I need to carry somebody else's shame. I mean, it's just not healthy. And that was part of the expectation. And, had I recognized that that's how far they were going to take it, I would not have been interested at all.
Talk about a left-handed gift from the gods, Suzannah, that your own difficult experiences inoculated you against this poisonous ideology.
So it sounds like there was, so this was your first semester and these things were coming up right away. And you were getting the message that you were supposed to feel ashamed, or you said carry somebody else's shame. So how was this in every class, or did you have, like in my experience, there was an element of it in all my classes, but there was one class that was really like the heavy hitter, the DEI training course disguised as a psychology curriculum.
It was definitely in all of my classes. In terms of the training, I think where it came out most was in my ethics class, because that's where we were talking about the intersectionality, and a lot of these other issues.
Did you cover irony in ethics?
We should have. The irony is just, it's really pretty potent in that particular regard. But I ended up having the most difficulty in groups class, because that's where those ideas in the group setting really kind of came out. Because when you put people together and you have, told them, hey, these are microaggressions, you need to look out for these, and then you characterize a certain kind of person who is supposed to be responsible for all of those problems, that is, you're looking for trouble right there. That's a really combustible mix, and that's what happened. And that was pretty ugly. Groups being supposed to be a confidential space, I don't want to talk about the details, but I will say that those dynamics are bad. They're really bad.
So there was,
and it definitely came out.
I do think that the group classes have become one of the tools that ideological predators use to indoctrinate the vulnerable. And because they understand that the group can be much more effective at pressing extreme ideologies onto people than they as individuals can. And so they do, even the classes that aren't group oriented per se, that are not about group therapy per se, will often be introduced as kind of a group. It's almost like if you were going into, say, intersectionality class, it's not taught as a seminar, it's taught as a, some kind of quasi therapy group class. And of course that there are very subtle mechanisms to get people to understand what the laws of belief are within that group, and that those laws of belief, those boundaries of belief, must be enforced, and that those who are part of the group will be subjected to continuous pressure from the other group members. And yet off in the distance is this escape from this pressure. It's a little door that might be labeled ideological compliance. And if you go through there, and if you agree with them, and if you confess, then all of a sudden you were brought within the warm embrace of the group. I mean, it's essentially negative reinforcement. We're going to make the situation intolerable for you until you comply.
Really something gross. That's really interesting about this, that pressure you're describing, it's so interesting how much of that comes from the students. And I in my experience, it was like being like, you're looking around wondering, how did I get here? Where it's coming from the teacher and it's coming from the students, and they all believe this thing. Why did they all believe this thing? Am I crazy? And it's this really weird experience. And Christine Stephen has talked about that experience of being a teacher and having the students pressure her to spout the ideology and push back against her.
I definitely, I'm not surprised to hear her say that. And I do think that students are a significant source of pressure. My question is, how did that happen? If the students had been introduced to the materials of the program in a way that was about, say, diversity of thought, or a truth as a pathway to benevolence in addressing these intractable issues, might there be a different kind of pressure? Or do the students get the idea of what are the acceptable parameters, and then the couple who adhere to that begin to get status, and then in order to achieve status, other people start to buy into those few, and all of a sudden it turns into this thing where everybody is afraid not to comply. And I really don't know if that comes more from the students or more from the faculty, but I do think that the faculty encourage it. They don't do anything to stop that process, which is dereliction of duty, frankly.
What's
Absolutely.
the psychological process for that? What is is it that the school gives cues that this is the way we want, this is the orientation that we have, or the ideology that we want to uphold, and then the students hear those cues and then act as enforcers and get some kind of social reward for acting in that enforcement role?
I definitely know that's true, but I don't know if it's a causal relationship. One of the things that I really dislike is the fact that oftentimes in students, what happens to students coming into counseling programs is from day one of the orientation, and often during the interview process itself, that they are taught, I mean, and they're not even subtle about this, that even if that it goes something like this, even if you think that you are, a really good person, and you think that you're not racist or prejudiced at all, you are being extremely harmful. And again, like, the way out of thinking of yourself as an extremely harmful person, there's this door labeled ideological compliance that people can go through. And so the people who become the nodding heads are the ones that the professor is going to gravitate towards. And then I also think that the professors put extra negative pressure on people who do not comply. And it might be in very subtle ways, but the degree of manipulation is just, I just don't know how anyone with any reasonable moral outlook can engage in that kind of behavior. But it's blatant, it's not even disguised, and nobody says anything about it. It's just, there's just sort of, nodding heads, and no one says, hey, wait a minute, really? How do you know that? And I don't know, where are all the people who are so very harmed and being hospitalized and everything else before your ideas came? Where is that population that was suffering horribly until in 2010 you told us about microaggressions? Can somebody answer that for me? And so far no one seems to have an answer, but they get really angry when I ask that question.
Well, I think that it was in my program, it was me when I did push back against a number of those trainings directly in front of the class that, got me flagged as problematic. And then it was the faculty that, enforced pushing me out. As I mean, going into it, I don't know if you had this experience, Leslie, but I was the only older student in my cohort. And they very much designed the program so that people would come together as a tight knit group in the cohort. And I was 20 years older than the closest person. So, it was always going to be, a hard road to make that kind of a connection, which looking back on it, I think is maybe not a good goal. That's not the goal that the program should have. But there were a number of instances where, we had things, where, they asked the class, well, what do you think about this? And what do you think about this? One of the things that UT did a lot was they had what they call their chorus values. And those were things that they wanted to impart to the student. So, and the chorus stands for different things.
Let me guess, Suzannah. It was they wanted to make outstanding therapists. That was their was their value. And they wanted to make sure that their therapists were well read and ready to engage with a pluralistic population who might hold values different than theirs. But that must have been the extent of it, right? It was only about producing excellent therapists who could engage with people from whom they differ, right?
Oh, well, yeah, sure. Yeah. They had their whole set of trainings though, and their values were like they had just added humility as one. And what I learned is what they meant by humility is not what I would mean by humility. What they meant by humility is shut up and do what we tell you to do. But yeah, openness. We were supposed to be open and self-aware. By self-aware, what that meant was, if you're white, you should be self-aware that you're privileged and bad and all of that. It was absurd. And when I talked about, we had specific trainings that we had to come in for these values. And I remember one in particular where they were wanting to say that if you had had an experience with somebody in the past, a racist experience, and you had harmed somebody, that you should not go talk to them about that kind of a thing. And, like go back and apologize. Well, having lived a half a century, I've already lived some of this stuff. And so I said, well, I grew up back in the 1970s, and I've talked to some of I grew up right by Fort Bragg, which I guess is now Fort Liberty. But yeah, it was a very mixed neighborhood, and it was the 1970s, and we did stupid stuff. And as I grew and matured, I've gone back and talked to a number of my classmates and said, oh, sorry about that. And it turned out to be a very positive experience. And what they were trying to present in the program is that you should not have those conversations, because as a white person, you're imposing on the other person that, like you're going to them needing forgiveness, rather than, let's just kind of connect as human beings and acknowledge that we were dumb when we were younger.
What would happen if, instead of breaking ourselves into tribes, we adopted a stance where please engage each other as humans? Wouldn't that be a very interesting way to sort of tilt that onto its head? But let's all we white people are humans, so let's engage people as humans first, and then maybe at some point, if we have, well, I can't even imagine under what circumstances it would be good to become tribal, but why not connect through our humanity? Why not do that?
Well, another thing that instruction not to go back and apologize to someone if you recognize that you did something that made them feel bad or hurt them in the past, and you've come to think differently about it and you feel sorry for it, don't go back and apologize to them. That's a very counterintuitive instruction, which I think also undermines your sense of reality and your ability to trust yourself. It seems like a deliberate effort to confuse people and make them not trust their own intuition.
Well, it's also a hell of an overreach. I mean, it's none of your damn business who I feel like I should apologize for. Why don't you? Okay, I'm really trying not to like 4-letter words seem to be the only appropriate response. But
I feel that.
why don't you go somewhere? in telling me who I would apologize for and under what circumstances I would do that. I think an apology is probably one of the most personal things that someone could work out for themselves, and no professor anywhere has any business whatsoever intruding into that personal space, and people who think they do are in desperate need of some deep work themselves.
Yeah. I want to read something from the chat here because it calls back to what you were saying about your group class. It's Tiffany DePede. Sorry if I'm pronouncing your name wrong, Tiffany. Says the group dynamics class, Tiffany was also in a program, she's sharing about this, was awful. My group turned on me and demanded I acknowledge myself as oppressive. I got no support from professors. And it just sounds like a complete nightmare.
That sounds awful. That should not happen to you.
Yeah.
Is that similar to your experience, Suzannah?
Very similar. And, following our student handbook, what I did in that situation, we were supposed to talk with professors. If we were having difficulties with another student and couldn't work it out amongst ourselves, we were supposed to talk to one of our professors. And I talked to two and got no support. And I ended up on a student support plan, which I asked for, which they had first threatened to put me on one like a couple of weeks prior because my thinking was too concrete and I was told that I was transphobic. I never got based on what evidence, but yeah. And when I was in that student support meetings, the first thing that they asked me to do was to write an apology for what had happened at group and to basically take responsibility for the entire situation.
What were you supposed to be sorry for?
What exactly are they referring to there?
Well,
I know it's hard to talk about it without getting specific.
If I'm being
right.
That's
it's hard to but I guess riffing off of what the questioner brought up, it was a very similar situation. And they wanted me to take responsibility for it in its entirety. You know, I was being held responsible for things that, in my opinion, I did not have a responsibility for. You know, I cannot take responsibility for something that I didn't do. You know, and I learned later on, and you know, I assume from the fact that one of my professors in the student support thing mentioned it to me, that it's no longer confidential. But they told me that my group leader had taken issue with a story that I had told from my growing up. I went to school in Greensboro, and I happened to be there before the old Woolworths was closed down, the one where they had the sit-ins. And I went and I visited there because it was within walking distance of the university. It was like the only store that was of that type, and it was cheap. You know, as a young student, I needed that. And my group leader had taken issue with that, but didn't bring it up in the context of that. And like, I don't understand what the issue was, but that was presented to me as further evidence that I was culturally insensitive, you know, basically a bigot, because I didn't know what the issue was.
What was upsetting about that to someone.
Right. Yeah. I don't know. I
That's really confusing.
It was very confusing. The whole thing was very confusing.
I'm curious about when you started this program, when did you first start to have these conflicts? Was it right away, or was it kind of gradually? Did it happen all at once? And were you being called out? Because it sounds like you were being called out, not you calling out the teaching. It wasn't you so much raising questions. It was you. They were finding fault with you. Is that how it went?
Yeah. And I think it was, well, I thought things were going pretty well. And it wasn't until, you know, a lot of reflection afterwards, because I found the whole situation is just incredibly disorienting and confusing. But it was about 6 weeks in where I was called in to my advisor's office. And that's when I was informed that my thinking was too concrete. And that, and that I need to fix that. And, you know, that I was also transphobic. And, you know, this was also after we had those classes on, you know, those values that they wanted, those course values that they wanted us to, you know, absorb. But I had been calling out different parts of the curriculum as things went on. So like I gave my experience that was directly counter to what they were presenting when they said, you know, that we should not be going back to apologize. I said, oh, well, you know, I've done that already, and it actually worked out great. And, you know, we were a lot closer afterward. And, you know, they didn't like that. I had complained about, in one of my papers, about the chorus teaching, because from my point of view, you know, at a half century, I'm not a 20-year-old who doesn't really know myself anymore. I've got a pretty good idea about what I stand for and what's important to me. And I felt like if they didn't think that I already valued those values, they probably shouldn't have brought me into the program, you know, because man, if you're over 50 and, you know, you don't already value being self-reflective and, you know, value openness, you're probably not going to get it at that point. And so I had complained in a couple of my papers saying that, you know, this is kind of invalidating, you know, I'm not sure what you're wanting from me here, you know, at my age. And there were other incidents where material was being presented. You know, they bring up these values quite a lot during the lectures. And there was at one point I pointed out that what they were doing, how they were presenting them is like, this was not an achievable goal. They were saying, you need to work at this and you need to pay attention to it all the time. And I just said in front of the class, this is not an achievable goal, what you're
Well,
asking us
and
to do here.
what if it's wrong? Had they
Yeah.
ever considered the possibility that there are other approaches, a common humanity approach, rather than a hyper-racialized approach to these sort of conflicts? Have they looked at the work of someone like Daryl Davis, who approaches this from a common humanity approach, and might they, the faculty at the University of Tennessee, who apparently really need to take a close look at themselves, and asked, are we enacting the virtues that we would like our students to adopt? Are we open? Are we intellectually, do we have intellectual humility? And it seems to me that there is some evidence here that they would fail abysmally at the virtues that they are wanting to espouse. And maybe the faculty of counseling at the University of Tennessee should take a close look at that. Maybe they could hire a
I would say
consultant.
absolutely.
Yeah,
Hmm.
yeah, because
Yeah, I would
they're
say
feeling horribly.
absolutely.
Yeah. You know what really, really, really gives me the willies, Suzannah,
Mm.
is what those students who hopped on board with sort of the mobbing in this class, what they took away from that class. Because all of these classes, and this seems to have been forgotten, and I don't know why KCREP and the ACA can't get their act together and take a look at this. In educational experiences like that, it is practice for how you do group therapy in the real world. Now, suppose that there is someone like Suzannah here, mature, experienced, has had some very difficult experiences in her life that have made her wary of taking on the task of perhaps carrying someone else's guilt. And suppose that that person who, maybe is like Suzannah, comes to one of the graduates of the University of Tennessee counseling program, a group therapy that they are running, and imagine what happens to that incredibly vulnerable person who is not on board with this. Is the faculty at the counseling program at the University of Tennessee happy with how they are portraying a good and healthy therapy experience? Are they expecting that their students, when they're conducting therapy groups, are going to allow and encourage a kind of mobbing and a demanding of apology? And I can't imagine that they have thought through that they have reached the end of that thought process. They seem to have been blocked by in the midst of a momentary moralistic spasm, adolescent moralistic spasm, where they're not looking to where their procedures and ideas are likely to lead. They're only aware of wanting to enforce the ideas that are within their program. That is incredibly irresponsible.
This is something like what I was thinking. I think you articulated it better, but I was thinking when I took a group class in my counseling program, and it was very good. It was one of the better classes that I had in my program. And there was this, I guess it was sort of a group within a group, because it's kind of a meta group situation where you've got the group and then there's the teacher who's outside of the group, sort of helping to kind of hold and facilitate and create the structure that the group is in. So we had two groups throughout the semester. There was the one who was active and the one that was observing, and they just switched off and took turns. And then the teacher sort of held the whole thing together. And so for it to get that out of hand, where somebody is being singled out and the teacher not to step in and perform the facilitator role of helping to integrate this process for everybody so that it provides a therapeutic experience and an educational experience for everybody, it seems horribly irresponsible and unethical.
Sure does. And it's like, where in any group therapy book is it,
it's okay to mob
someone? Is it covered that it's okay to allow the group to ensure that one of the members complies, bullies another member to the point where, they comply? That's madness. I mean, that's a struggle session.
Yes.
Do you want to make people into red shirts? Is that, you want to base the group class on Maoism? Is that the idea? I do not understand how these practices escape the realm of reasonable reflection. Like, oh, is that going well? What is going on with these people that they don't see this as a problem? Oh my God.
Well, and something else, Tiffany, when you, or I'm sorry, I'm talking to Tiffany. I see Tiffany in the chat. I was going to read her other comment that she said. She said that that she went to the program office for support and was in tears while the group followed, yelling at her. It sounds like an absolute nightmare. But Suzannah, you mentioned, and I'm sorry, Tiffany, I didn't mean to say that so offhandedly. I was reading your comment at the same time as thinking about this other stuff. But you mentioned that you were significantly older than all the other students. And that wasn't the case in the program that I was in. There were some younger people. I'd say the average age was probably in their 30s, but there were plenty of people that were older. I was in my early 40s, and there were people who were in their 60s. It was a wide range of people. But one of the things, and I don't know if this is beside the point, and it's just kind of an observation, but I'm thinking if the average student, or you said you were 20 years older than the next youngest or next oldest person. And so that's a really young cohort. And these are people that don't have a lot of life experience under their belt, and they're being educated and filled with this perspective. And then they're being armed to go out into the community and work as the, a reference point for what it means to be a psychologically healthy person, which is just, I'm just that I don't have a real I don't know what my question is, but I'm just observing that. And that's kind of it's making me feel uncomfortable thinking about that.
Yeah. This is why I feel like this is teaching malpractice. I don't see how you can come out from this program and and this is not to throw my former classmates under the bus. I think a lot of them are really well-meaning and will eventually make great therapists. I do think that they will have obstacles to overcome based on this training. I think that this training is in and of itself malpractice. My experience of it was really awful. And I hear what Tiffany is saying. I had a similar experience where I also broke down in the context of that group situation and was just, I couldn't stop crying. And that's when I, went in and asked for the support plan, which I thought was going to be.
You thought it was going to be supportive.
She's frozen up right now.
And it was a very, very, I don't understand how the faculty can, I don't know what stories they're telling themselves to make it okay, their approach on this. It was a very, it was a very re-traumatizing experience for me in terms of that, which is why it has, kind of taken me a while to get to where I can even verbalize some of what happened in a way that made sense, because so much of it just doesn't make sense. Why would they do that? I don't know. It just, I feel like they were so captured inside of this ideology. And maybe a part of it is that in Tennessee had just been that year had been given a rating as the least welcoming for LGBTQ issues. And perhaps they felt like that made them even more under threat and heightened their own anxiety that we are being pursued, even though, we're still having, pride events, all of these other things. I mean, heck, I've even marched in the Knoxville Pride Parade. But I think that they took those things and internalized them in a way that increased their anxiety to the point that cruelty was okay. I think that's what happened. Because it was definitely cruel. It was absolutely cruel.
I think I'm about to have a feline issue here that I'm going to have to quickly rectify while I let her out. Pardon me, everybody.
It's one of the things that is striking to me is that these are people who are telling you about ways to behave and set boundaries around your behavior and your expectations of other people, and trying to teach you healthy ways of communicating, and then they act in ways that are contrary to that, like directly contradictory. And it's as if this situation, this social justice backdrop, the institutional oppression, or whatever they want to call it, gives them license to suspend the normal healthy communication and behavior. And they don't even recognize that they're making that exception. Like, they refuse to acknowledge that they're making that exception, but that exception is plain. Like, if you have a big enough emotional problem with something, go ahead and suspend all of your normal ethical, moral behavior. And I don't, it's been perplexing to me how psychology professionals and educators can act this way,
right,
and be blind to it. I don't understand that.
I have to say, I am not myself an expert in international affairs by any means, but I can't help have noticed the dehumanization involved in what's going on universities around the Palestine-Israel conflict, where it appears there's this narrative out there that somehow what happened on October 7th should be excused or understood as having been, I don't know, somehow a justified response to past wrongs. And I was amazed at the extent of the dehumanization narrative towards Israel that I've been seeing across the United States. Now, I would imagine that one could have a reasonable discussion about the conflict between Palestine and Israel, and that could be fleshed out. But to have the events of October 7th somehow reframed as being at something that should be laid at the feet of Israel just is beyond me. But it really, I keep thinking I've gotten to the point where I can't be shocked anymore. But just watching what's going on campuses with the ability of, bright, privileged, young people just losing their ability to think of other people as human beings it astounds me. It really astounds me. And I'm still trying to figure this out myself, but it has made me think that perhaps the woke phenomenon within the profession is much worse than I had conceptualized. It's sometimes I'm wondering if even I, who have was in forced proximity to some of this, really understand the extent of the crazy here. And that is, so I too, Suzannah and Leslie, wonder, what are these people thinking? How can they possibly think that they're doing right by the students, and in particular, right by the students' eventual clients, some of whom, through their narrow and effed up ideology, would be considered oppressors? How
Well,
are they preparing their students to work with people that the students have been trained to think of as oppressors?
have you seen the recent issues of Counseling Today?
No, I'm happy to say I missed those. I think I'm about to be further horrified, though.
Well, one of the things that we had to do is become members of the ACA, the American Counseling Association, for anybody else out there who doesn't recognize that. But we were required to join the ACA for our insurance, but we were also encouraged to read all of their materials and that sort of thing. And so their magazine, Counseling Today, is one of the things that has been coming to my house. And I think I've just now finished up my subscription. But in the videos that I made about my experience, I call out some of the things that they have recently been printing in there. So, like in the October issue, the president of the ACA is talking about decolonizing the profession. And they are making calls to, I mean, like, what else are we going to call that? But, we're going to racistly get out the white people. And in the September issue, there is which I happen to have right over here by me. There is an article about navigating white privilege in the counseling room, and one of the quotes that they pull out, talks about how you avoid perpetuating toxic whiteness in counseling spaces. And like,
How do
when
you
we
do that?
talk
How
about
do you do
things,
that? What's
well,
their advice?
well, well, what their advice is that you should be thinking about your whiteness all the time.
And this is
It
from
and it was
October?
this is
Oh,
from
God.
this is from October. This is
Okay.
if my camera will pick it up here. Yeah, it's this article, which is on the website right now. You can go and see it even if you don't have the subscription anymore. But I highly recommend, taking a minute and checking it out. Also, this is the one where they talk about decolonizing the profession. That is also on the Counseling Today website, and you can read it without a subscription. But yeah, what they're saying is that counselors should be thinking about their whiteness and their white privilege, not just in the counseling room, but all of the time, so that they are always decentering themselves. I mean, and like, from where I'm coming from, if you're constantly decentering yourself, that really sounds like you're in the midst of a narcissistic relationship.
Yeah, I would
We're
reframe that as navel gazing. That
yeah.
like I would be shocked if people who actually do this hear 1/3 of what their patients are actually saying to them. Because since becoming a full-time therapist, I can tell you that none of this stuff is relevant. I do occasionally encounter people who are victims of racism, sexism, transphobia. I mean, that stuff is real, and it can be addressed without any of this DEI stuff. And I would never navel gaze, take my attention off of my patients and put it on myself in the context of the therapy session. They're not paying me to navel gaze. They're paying me to bring my knowledge to bear to assist them in navigating these intractable difficulties that they're having in their lives. And what Counseling Today is pushing is utterly, completely, in all other ways, irrelevant to the actual act of helping. It's a waste of paper and ink to put it out there. It literally serves no purpose other than kind of a moral masturbatory one.
Well, and I think it's worse. It's worse than just irrelevant. It is, as Suzannah said, malpractice, because not only are you not helping, not only are you not training people who are able to, as you say, really listen to their clients or patients and understand them and help them, but they're creating new problems for these people. They're helping these people to create new neuroses.
Oh my gosh, I have a yard elf coming into the picture here. No, that
Hello,
is
yard
my
elf.
wife going out to thousands of people who are watching. Yeah, it is. They are preaching malpractice. They're preaching navel gazing, and none of it is needed or required. I would say the one good thing is that I think the market, the free market of therapy is beginning to take effect. In the last few months, I've had no fewer than, I don't know, 4 or 5 new patients come in and say that, you know, here I have this really difficult problem that I'm trying to navigate with my patients, or with my family, or with my, you know, whatever. And they're running into these counselors who are saying things like, well, I'm just really glad that you were able to find your voice. Like some nonsensical, vacuous kind of nonsense that is what passes for sophistication in counselor training these days. And these people are leaving the therapists who are preaching that kind of nonsense, and are looking for people who actually can help them out with some of these issues.
And I think that's really good for people who are in private practice and clients who can both afford and have the option of seeing a private practice counselor or coach. But the thing that really concerns me is these schools are funneling people into community mental health and education settings. So they're putting people in, they're really focusing on school counselors, and there's an increase in the number of school counselors as a response to the lockdowns and what that did to students. And so they're really pushing for more counselors in schools. And the counselors who are going into schools are these young people that are charged up to become activists.
Yeah.
And so it just sort of creates this cycle of indoctrination. And that's what really concerns me. It's not so much the private practice,
and it is going to
mobile people.
It's a really good point, Leslie, that this is going to come down on the people who are most vulnerable to it, like the people who have to go to community mental health centers, and, you know, people who probably have the least amount of voice. You know, they haven't been trained to advocate for themselves, perhaps, or maybe they have mental illnesses that make it difficult for them to think and express themselves clearly, and they're just going to kind of be subjected to this stuff.
Right. And think of how seductive that is too, when you get an ideology that says none of this is your fault, it's institutional, you were a victim. And, you know, really are these people people who are hitting rock bottom to the point where they're in a community mental health setting. And I don't want to say that that's necessarily rock bottom for everybody, but it's really a tough place to be.
It is. Yeah.
And to be fed this ideology that either you're an oppressor or you've been oppressed by everything. It's not a resilience strategy. It's not a resilience building ideology at all. It's a resentment building ideology. And so not only those people, but also the kids who are subject to counseling in schools who are
I've heard some
captive.
Really disturbing things about that. Someone was telling me that there was a school counselor who was coming in to do a class learning with, I think they were like 6th graders or something. And there was a parent there who was watching this, and the parent was a psychotherapist, and so caught on to what was going on. And what happened was that the school counselor sort of identified who the cool kid in the class was, and then, you know, sort of focused a lot of attention on them. And this particular training was about gender identity, which I, you know, I don't want to go down the rabbit hole here, but I've been trying to think about, you know, what would be a way to maybe raise some of these issues but circumvent the process of indoctrination and be very aware and careful of, you know, the social contagion effect. You know, this school counselor here in Vermont, used that social contagion effect because she focused on the cool kid in the class. And then by the end of the class, both this kid and her 6 friends were identifying as they, them.
Oh my gosh.
Now, I mean, and you could look at that and say, oh, well, so what? But one of the things that is happening right now, there's 2 things that are really concerning about this. One is you can't tell who transitions is going to subsequently detransition. That's one. Like, no one can say that right now. The other is that there's a social that within this social contagion of gender ideology, there is pressure on children to, you know, if starting to socially transition is good, moving on to medical transition is great. And there, you know, it's like, how authentic, it's a game of how authentic can you be? And you combine that with a lot of parents who are being blatantly misinformed or being told that they're terrible if they don't go along with these ideas. It's a really dangerous kind of situation. That's one thing that, like, I heard that and I thought, oh my God, that's so awful. And yet, like, that was another time where I'm like, I keep thinking I can't be surprised, and I keep being surprised. But another thing that's going on right now is they're having the older students, you know, like I don't know how they're broken up now, but you have the older class of students coming down and talking to the younger class of students. So you have the 5th graders coming down and talking to the 2nd graders about social justice issues.
Oh my gosh.
It's sort of, it's another version of, like,
it's like the Greta
cool kid
Thunberg
effect.
effect, trying
And
to get kids to,
the 5th graders are being used because they can't possibly understand what it is that they're pushing. And, you know, of course, the 2nd and 3rd graders can't process this. They just know that the cool kids who they want to be like are telling them that all of these things are a good idea.
You know, that's such a clever way to do this if you wanted to spread this ideology, because one of the things I've thought is that kids have this, you know, there's this natural individuation rebellion process as we become teenagers, and that teenagers are going to get sick of the teachers and the adults telling them, feeding them their rebellion the way that they've been doing. You know, it's going to look like this is going to be the next thing that gets, that they're going to grow tired of this. But if you use kids in order to pass this on to kids, then you kind of you can keep it going a little bit longer.
Oh yeah, I mean, and I can remember well in high school, like, the, you know, the difference between the 9th and the 12th graders, and you try and, like, go over to the 12th graders table and, like, sneak in because they're the cool kids, and they tell you to go away. And so, so there really is this hierarchy. And I think you're absolutely right, Leslie, that children are going to rebel against the obvious authority. But if the cool kid's telling you to do it, I mean, it's like the peer pressure thing. Like, it's such a, and I just, like, what is wrong with school counselors that they don't stop and say, you know, there's something about this that just doesn't quite strike me as right. Like, what part of them as human beings is missing right now that they don't see that that's wrong?
They're very young, for one thing. I think many of them are very young. My nephew is a school counselor, and I think he's wonderful. I'm sure we've had conversations about this. His thinking on this is more aligned with mine than with the social justice stuff, as far as I can tell, but he's very young. I mean, he got his master's in counseling and was licensed at 23 or 24 years old.
Yeah.
And so you think about, it's not that you can't be a helpful support at that age. Surely you can. Surely there's a role, that you can fill at that age, but it's harder because you haven't been through a lot of life at that point.
Yeah. Well, that's a really good point. But
Yeah.
you raise an interesting question. I'm just wondering, I think we have about 15 minutes left. I wonder if we should talk a little bit. I don't know if Suzannah, you got to say everything you wanted to say, and I'd be interested in that. But I also I think I would really like us to talk about solutions if we could find some time to do that.
Yeah, well, that's what I was thinking is I think, all of these things are where, I mean, at least with the schools, parents have got to step in, they have to take some actions in order to counterbalance this, whether it is, in homeschooling, which I know is a very big ask for a lot of people. That's problematic, but talking to, being aware of what's going on in their schools, being aware of who is their counselor, what their counselors are doing. I think there are so many different areas in which people need to start considering some of these choices, whether it's, just on the front line, like, I've had a number of people who know what's happened to me ask me, well, it's like, well, geez, I need to go see a counselor. How do I find one that is not, captured by this? And, I'm kind of in the position of saying, well, try and find somebody who's older, and, have the conversation. I used to have conversations with people who were concerned, it's like, well, what if my therapist is really religious? How do you do that? It's like, well, you need to have that conversation immediately. Just, walk in and say, hey, I don't believe this, or I don't want this to be part of the therapy. And that's still not going to be a perfect measure. Somebody really deeply believes this ideology, they're going to find a way to bring it in. If it's part of your thinking that white people are privileged, or whatever group is privileged and another group is marginalized, you're going to find a way to work that in to how you're interacting with the people, and that is going to be a problem. I for myself, I have been talking to, my local state representative. I just did that on Tuesday, and we're looking ahead to the next state congressional cycle, at the beginning of the new year. And I'm not sure what's going to happen right now, but he has asked me if I'd be willing to testify, and yes, the answer is yes. I will go on the record for what happened to me and how I feel like this is harming people. But I think that people need to be aware of what's going on, and they need to start speaking up about it. I mean, I think one of the important things, or a number of the important things, is we need to call a thing. So, like, this is malpractice, and we need to use those words. It can't be like, this is bad. We need to say, this is actually malpractice. This is hurting people. It is racist. This training is racist. No matter what what they're trying to say, that is what it is. And we need to.
Well, and I'd like to just speak to something to
okay.
that real quick, Suzannah, because I know that there could be people who are going to look at this and say, oh, and this happened to me when I made a video about this topic, that people looked at me and said, oh, how can you object to white people, being, singled out for the race or something? And I just want to point out that, or they confuse concerns about that with white supremacy or something like that.
Mhm.
And I just want to point out to anyone who has those kinds of concerns that if you connect social ills to persons of a particular race, no matter what that race is, and we've read that story many times before with many different races, you are saying that these difficulties are best racialized, and that is never going to go well for anybody, because if it can be racialized for one group, it can be racialized for another. And what we are implicitly supporting is exactly the same kind of dehumanization that we're seeing following that probably are behind the events of October 7th, and that are behind all the awfulness that's going on college campuses. All those things have been racialized, and we really need to stop conflating race and culture. And we definitely need to stop attributing societal ills to people of a particular race. And whiteness might be a fashionable version of that same toxic story. And it's fashionable and it seems okay, but you are still participating in fundamentally the same kind of dehumanizing, awful solutions that have led to the worst tragedies in human history. Like, it is not that hard to do better than that. If you just look at people like Daryl Davis, and with a moment's thought, I could probably name 5 or 6 others: Coleman Hughes, John McWhorter, Thomas Sowell makes really cogent arguments about this. Just look at the true humanitarians and follow their lead. It's not hard, but don't give in to the fashion of looking at a particular race and giving into the to the savage joy of pointing at them and experiencing the high that comes with that kind of awfulness.
Well, it seems like people really want to find a way to distance themselves from aspects of human nature that they don't want to see in themselves, and will go to great lengths to do that and to attribute it to some characteristic of the other.
Yeah.
And so that seems like that's a process that's playing out in a lot of ways around these intersectional identities.
I think so.
Something that I wanted to read from the chat, Cowlick Combs says, I think we should be teaching our young people to start speaking to older trusted family members and friends who used to naturally serve as counselors. And this brings up what I think is a really good point. I think we over therapize children. And I think that parents need to be very careful about who they let be an authority figure to their child. That goes for teachers, doctors, counselors, etc. There's a real undermining of the family structure and parental authority that goes on when we allow people that we don't vet very carefully to have a lot of influence over our children.
I think that's very wise. And I wanted to tack on to what you were talking about with I don't know if you quite put it in these terms, Leslie, but the intersectional rage, maybe. I've been thinking about this lately. I've been thinking about this since October 7th, and I have noticed this rage that comes up, around the social justice issues and the viciousness associated with people who are sort of claiming to be, very humanistic and concerned, I guess, about the hurting of people or people who are hurting. And, I'm just looking at that viciousness and I'm thinking, what is that viciousness component to this? And I do have a thought about that. And one of the things I'll see in my practice from time to time is, like, people will come in and they'll have these awful thoughts about people that they're mad at, or, whatever. And the way that I learned to talk to people about that, and I think this is probably true. It's an idea that comes from Freud, but there is a significant part of each and every one of us that is vicious, that is self-serving, that is, for want of a better word, evil. that is destructive. And
Mm.
I think we all have that capacity for sure. And maybe that's just sort of maybe we all have that, in just day to day walking around. And that's just how people are. And some of us manage it better than others. But I think what the social justice rage phenomenon might be is that I think that a lot of people need to find ways to discharge that vicious, destructive energy in socially acceptable ways, because there are so many non-socially acceptable ways to discharge that negative energy that we build up. And I think one of the things that might be going on is that social justice, it provides a mechanism that is viewed as a highly moralistic thing to be doing, but that allows for the most vicious things to happen towards other people, where you just treat other people in a dehumanizing, awful kind of way, and then can celebrate yourself as a highly moral person for doing that. And so I've been wondering about that the part of the personality that I'm speaking of is called the id.
Mhm.
And I'm wondering if perhaps what we're seeing right now is a lot of people who are discharging this sort of libidinal destructive energy that flows from the id, but they're doing it in such a way that actually gives them status.
Mm.
And that would be
Wow, that's
quite
really interesting.
that would be quite a mechanism. I'd be very interested if any therapists are watching what they think of that, and do they think that holds water, or maybe not. It's just something I've been thinking to myself
It's really
for the
interesting.
last
And
couple of weeks.
at the risk of taking us on a tangent, I'll say that I've noticed, I've had some observations around this over the past week or so, as there's been this whole AGP gate. If you've been following that, the blue dress, the man in the dress discourse. I don't want to take us down that rabbit hole, because it'll derail what we're
It's a
doing.
long story.
Yeah, it's a long story, but I will say, I think that there are a lot of logical and valid arguments against the individual's theory or behavior that people could raise, but instead of raising valid arguments, there's just a lot of offloading of rage. There's a lot of, and it seems very irrational in some ways, and it's been very interesting to watch this stir up in the internet discourse. And what you're saying about looking for a channel for that that destructive sort of antisocial side of ourselves, while also achieving status. And I also think that distancing yourself from the behavior or the aspect of human nature that you're finding repulsive might be a part of that. It's projecting it outward and pushing it away from the self.
Oh, that's so interesting.
Yeah.
That's so interesting. So
I think it's,
I wouldn't. Oh, go ahead, Suzanne.
well, I was going to say, I think it's also a way to avoid having to, address and interact with the fear and uncertainty that, I feel like is pervasive in our culture right now. We have the situation going on in the Middle East, and then there's also Ukraine, and we don't know what's going to even happen with our own presidency. For me, I feel that uncertainty, just it feels awfully palpable most of the time. And I think that for a certain segment of people, it is much easier to, latch onto a moralistic ideology that tells you this is good and that's bad, and all I have to do is go yell and be angry at somebody, and then you don't ever really have to engage with that uncertainty about your own actions or your status or even what's going to happen, because you have discharged all of that in your anger, in that rage that you were talking about.
Suzannah, as you're talking, I think that there's so much understanding of human behavior that you bring. And it's such a shame that you were
Yeah,
that you were stymied in your attempt to get to the career that you wanted. What are you,
for sure.
what is next for you? And are you finding an alternative route to continue pursuing that professional goal?
Yeah, I don't know what is next for me. I had a window in my divorce settlement in order to be able to get the degree, which when they, you know, said that I could not start my practicum, meant that the degree would take an additional year, which, there was just no way that I could afford. And by that point, I had been like pretty thoroughly traumatized and needed to go back and get that straightened out. And while I'm emotionally now in a better place and I feel I've worked on some other skills. I got my undergraduate in English and I'm a pretty good writer. I am trying to figure that out. I don't know. When I look at the, materials coming out of the ACA, the idea of trying to go to another program and get further involved in this career is just like, heck no. And, while I could see the possibility of, being a coach, I'm not quite sure, how to start that process. And, I think that I probably could be good at that. I have done a lot of volunteer counseling work, or, peer
Like
support.
peer counseling, yeah.
Mm-hmm.
Well,
Yeah.
this is what
So,
I think I've really, I keep coming back to this as a real problem right now, not just for this profession, but for a culture that has come to rely on this profession. And that's that there are good people who want to work as supportive counselors, coaches, etc. And the training programs are so compromised that in order to get to, in order to acquire the education and the training necessary to do a good job in this way, you have to run this gauntlet of social justice, um what, mind effery, what do you want to call it? It's just, I mean, it really messes with your mind. It's psychologically damaging to do this, to be put through this. And also there's we have a difficulty distinguishing, as you were describing, people are asking, how do I find a counselor who's not compromised by this ideology? So there, it's difficult for clients and patients who want to work with a counselor to know who they can trust. There's no dividing line, there's no clear demarcation. So I think that we need a parallel profession, and along with a parallel profession, we need parallel education opportunities. So we need some kind of a, whether it's counseling or whether it's coaching or whatever it is, something that gives people the training that they need to work with people in a really supportive and healthy fashion. That's divorced from this ideology, and that can take in new interested applicants and provide a kind of a credentialing system so that clients can know who to look for. I really think when you talk about what's next, I think that needs to be next.
Maybe something that's more on an apprenticeship model, that very minimal education followed by an abundance of practical application. And Leslie, I completely, like, in the short term, I also think that we really do need to help people distinguish between people who are qualified to do this work and people who are not. And I think one way to maybe, or another way to say that, people who do not view the therapy process as an opportunity to push a political agenda. Like, we need to separate those of us who take the counseling ethics that say that's a bad idea seriously, from those who have somehow found a way to twist ethics in a way that allow them to use to essentially gratify their ideological fantasies or needs at the expense of the people that they're working with. And I know Suzannah and I are both members of the Foundation Against Intolerance and Racism. And I wonder if, maybe one of the things, Suzannah, that you and I can follow up on, I don't know if FAIR would be interested in this, but I'm just talking off the top of my head. FAIR has a pro-human pledge, which is their version of ethics that, that say that things like you're going to remain nonviolent. I wonder if FAIR could have something like that for therapists, where therapists have agreed to a number of ethical stances, and then that can be a kind of a credential that those of us in private practice or in a coaching profession could put onto our websites that would say, you know, that we adhere to, you know, a pro-human, non-ideological approach to therapy.
That's something I'd be interested in exploring. I would be interested in that. I think that also there's a couple of things. There's the over medicalization as well. I think there are a few different aspects to how therapy is going right now, how it's being trained right now, that I would love to see something parallel to that spring up. There are a lot of people who don't want a diagnosis. They don't want to have, you know, that's the whole group of people that the counseling training process right now really leaves out, the worried well that they call them. You know, it's just people with lifespan problems that might want support. These people are not served very well by a medical model of therapy. And also I would like to see a model that has maybe like a philosophical counseling designation that's not medical, and it's not social engineering, it's exploratory, and it's not coming from a position of authority. It's more like a process exploration partnership. But I don't know, maybe I'm just brainstorming.
Well,
that sounds to me a lot like the existential therapy model or theory. And yeah, that I find that very interesting as well. I think that would be very productive, especially in, you know, the current context where those grand narratives are collapsing for a lot of people.
Could we each say like two things that anybody could do right now who's concerned about this could reasonably do? Like, what's like two things that someone who's concerned about these issues could do without exposing themselves to too much, you know, danger, but that might really, you know, give them a sense of relief or provide sort of a, you know, a positive direction? I'm sorry, I've got such an obnoxious cat who's letting me know that it's his dinner time. I hope that's not coming across too loud.
No, I didn't realize that was your feline problem still going on.
I have three feline problems. One of them's named Cookie, one of them's named Wooly, and one of them's named Joe, and they've all managed to be a problem over this time we've been speaking.
Well, what do you think, Suzannah? Do you have some suggestions you want to offer?
Well, I think, you know, as a chapter leader for FAIR, I think that you could join FAIR. I think that they are taking a very productive and unifying stance in this, you know, standing in that middle space and not polarizing these issues. I think that's one thing that people could do. And I think internally, one thing that people could do, you know, just in and of themselves, is take some time and think about what their own personal values are. You know, you have to have, I think, a solid grasp on what you value in order to be able to push back in these situations, whether they happen at work or whether they happen, you know, in a different social group or at school. You know, if I hadn't already had an idea of what I thought humility was, I might have accepted the university's idea of humility. But I put a lot of thought and work into that before I got there. And for me, that's what made the difference. You know, I remember seeing a poster, you know, if you know what you stand for, you know, you're not going to fall for things. You know, I'm sure I'm saying that not quite right, but
no, it's a lovely sentiment.
Yeah, that's great. You know? That's really great. I guess I think that we should or could disconnect from the internet more and make sure that if you are check the quality of your connections with other people,
Mhm.
and try to
Mhm.
have as high quality connection as possible.
Mhm.
I see too many people who most of their engagement is passive engagement on the internet. And I think it's really devastating. I think it teaches people to look at each other in terms of identities and archetypes rather than individuals with a lot of nuance and complexity. And
Mhm.
the the more the higher quality your engagements are, the more you see people as real people. So I think disconnecting some from the internet. And I think if you have children, really paying close attention to what their influences are is very
Mhm.
important. Take their phones away. Kids don't need cell phones. They maybe that you give them a dumb phone, let them make a phone call to you if they're out with their
Right.
friends, but don't give them a smartphone. Take their phones away.
For
If you've
sure.
already given them a phone, it's not too late to take it back. Tell them you made a mistake. Take it back. They
Yeah.
don't need, especially if they're under 16 years old or so.
Yeah.
And consider pulling them out of school if they're in one of these public education programs where they're being exposed to this. Consider looking for another educational program if you can, or homeschooling. So I know that's kind of, as you said, Suzannah, it's a big ask for a lot of people, but if it's possible for you, do it, I would say.
Mhm. And those are really good. I think, I guess I have like just three things. It's hard to pick two, but I think one thing I would say that it's really, really important that people really understand that it really is this bad, that there are a lot of professionals involved in critical social justice, and their job is to make critical social justice palatable. And so I've been looking a lot of the curriculum proposals in Vermont, and they are incredibly manipulative. Like, you can read the whole thing and you're not sure exactly what they're saying, but it sounds all vaguely good. But then, there's always one section, if you read down between the lines, at some point it'll say something about accountability. And it's like, it's the stick with which they're going to enforce this. And so I would say that, like, really allow yourself to take seriously the possibility that people who appear to be talking about very just and good things are not talking about just and good things. They are talking about awful things.
Mm.
And they're very, very, very good at playing on your best intentions, and in manipulating that in such a way so as to give them power and influence, which is what people who subscribe to this are after. They're after status and power and influence. And so allow yourself to take seriously the possibility that someone who says that they're very interested in so-called anti-racism or so-called social justice are not interested in either one of those things in any kind of reasonable person's definition of what those are about. The other thing that I did, which was really hard, I really enjoyed my education. I got all three of my degrees at Kent State University, where my father was a professor, and I have a very good, I have very nice memories of Kent State, but I'm ashamed to be associated with Kent State. I wish it didn't say that on my degree. I don't like my office as much because it has my degree that says Kent State University on it. And it makes me so sad because I remember that as being such a wonderful place. And yet, as wonderful as it was, it sold out to the so-called anti-racism, so-called diversity, equity, and inclusion nonsense. And it just shows me how incredibly weak the institution actually is. And so it's hard, but every fall when Kent State University calls me and asks me for money, I say, God, I'm not going to give you money anymore. I'm ashamed that I ever gave you money. I'm ashamed to have been associated with you. I can't believe what the part that you're playing in what you're doing to our society. And I'm giving my money to other causes who have shown themselves to be more thoughtful and forward thinking. And please lose my phone number. Another thing that I stopped doing is giving my money to NPR, which is another, like, I grew up on NPR. I loved NPR. I had a personal relationship with NPR, and I loved it. And then I can't listen to NPR for 5 minutes without feeling like I'm in crazy land. So I stopped giving money to NPR, and I can only hope that something is along the line that will come and replace the NPR shaped hole in my life. But the NPR I know is gone, and I had to sort of not be sentimental about stopping my supporting of these organizations, NPR and Kent State University, of who've been played such important roles in my lives and the life of my family, and looking at them and saying, I really miss who you used to be. Goodbye. So for
I
me,
think
those are
that's
some things
really
that were very
important.
important to do.
Yeah, you're voting with your wallet.
Yeah. So I would say people should, unless your university is a very special place that has resisted all this, I would look up and see if your university has DEI language and anti-racism language. And if it is vague, and if somewhere in there it talks about accountability, I would be very clear about no longer giving money to your university and making it clear to them why you're no longer giving money to your university, and maybe sharing how disappointed you are at the weakness that your university has shown in allowing itself to be captured by these things.
Well, is it other side of that same coin, employers out there who can relax their degree requirements for certain careers, doing that will make a big difference, because it will take away a lot of the power that's concentrated in those universities, maybe even more so than individual donations at this point.
That is a really good point. I think that's a fantastic point. And these institutions aren't what they used to be. And a degree in these circumstances, to put somebody through this process just in order to get an entry-level job seems kind of ridiculous. I wanted to make one point to there's two people in the chat that mentioned that they have trouble finding like-minded people where they live in person. And I think I can recognize the difficulty of that. And the one piece of advice that I would offer, and I wonder what the two of you think about this, but it's, even if you don't perceive people as being like-minded, try to find common ground and try to find ways to connect, because it does, just because this ideology and the way that we're dealing with people right now in the world, there's this real tendency to polarize and see things in black and white. But if you start to connect with people, even if you don't think they see things the way you do, even if they're very politically different, find a thing that you do connect on and focus on that, and try to find, there are usually things that you can enjoy together and agree on together. So I would suggest not focusing so much on having to talk about these things, but even if you can't find non-woke people, find people to talk to about non-woke things.
That's really, and by extension, and I think I heard you say this, you put out something the other day, Leslie, which is the single most valuable thing for me that I did, was I found people like you, Leslie, and you, Suzannah, people who I could talk to about these things, because when you're just surrounded by crazy, you need a reality check from other human beings. And I think
that's true.
Leslie's a part of the organization Solid Ground, and those people, Jen Friend, Jody, David, I don't know personally, and I don't know everyone personally there, but I do have a lot of friends who I've met through organizations like Critical Therapy Antidote and FAIR. But if you're just looking for something right now, I personally, I was pretty well versed on all of this, and I still needed to connect with people for the reality check. And so I joined Solid Ground, and I can't go very often, just because my schedule is the way it is. But when I go, it is just like such a breath of fresh air. So I don't mean to plug for Solid Ground, but that is, for me personally, that has been just so incredibly healthy to connect with smart, benevolent people who understand the reality of what's going on.
Yeah,
Yeah.
I that is why we created it. It's that exact thing that you're talking about. I found so much, it was so helpful to me to find CTA. It was such a it was I was in a really crazy place. I was really disoriented and emotionally overwhelmed with what was going on in my graduate program, and finding people who understood and saw the concerns. I felt the same way I did about the things that I was concerned about was a massive sanity check for me. It was something I really needed. And so we created the Solid Ground Support Network for that reason, to help people connect with other people and have those kind of conversations. And again, I'm like you, I'm not trying to really plug it. We're not making money off of it. It's $5 a month for people to join. So it's not like
it's
we're
very little
so I'm
money.
not like, it's not a big thing. I don't, that's not, there's no grift involved in it. It's really
Right.
just to connect people
Yeah.
to other people. And we hold synchronous meetings a few times a week, and there's a message board for people to connect there as well. So if you are interested in that and having trouble finding people to talk to and need a sanity check, you can find a Solid Ground Support. I think it's .com, but it might be .org, but look at both.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I'll put
I
it in
would
the
Just
notes.
completely benevolent and grounded interactions is what you'll find there.
Yeah.
I would agree with that. And I would say that I have found that in FAIR as well. But I would also say, don't be afraid to just talk about what your thoughts and your feelings are to other people. When I came out of my program, I was traumatized to the extent that I could not talk about it. And I basically told everybody that I ran into what had happened to me. And I was surprised at how receptive folks were, and surprised and supportive. I mean, outside of that program, I mean, of course, I am in Tennessee, so that might have something to do with it. But even when I went up to areas where I was afraid, like I'm a big anime nerd. And so I go to conventions. There's a couple that I participate in, and I thought for sure, if I'm going to run into trouble, that's where it's going to be. But I talked to a number of my friends there and was really open about my experience, and even there, people were supportive and did not realize the depths to which this ideology has gone. Even when they were passing out badge things that said what your pronouns were on there, they didn't understand. But once I informed them, they were really pretty horrified. So don't be afraid to step in there, because even if you run across somebody who really does believe that ideology, once you know, then
Yeah, and it's a good point. And speaking in hushed tones about this behind closed doors for fear of getting in trouble is a way to give it more power. So being able to speak openly and fearlessly, and not be worried about what somebody else is going to think about your opinion, is a great way to just give other people the courage to talk about it plainly as well. I think that's really good advice, Suzannah. Well, thank you both so much for joining me for this really engaging conversation. I've really enjoyed it, and really sorry for what has happened to you, Suzannah, but it sounds like they messed with the right person in a way, because you're taking it as far as you can. So
they did. Tiffany and Suzannah are the wrong kind of people to mess with. I think what these people are going to find out is, the message which I sure Suzannah has found, and I hope Tiffany has found, and to everyone else out there who's frustrated, is you really are not alone. Even though I know that it feels that way sometimes, but you're not. And thanks, Leslie, for allowing us to talk on your channel. I really enjoyed meeting you, Suzanne, and Leslie. It's always a pleasure.
Thank you.
Yeah, likewise. It was a pleasure. And thank you. I very much appreciate you opening up your space for me.
I'm delighted to meet you and to be able to have this